Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited today, and I hope you've had a great session so far previously. But I'm very excited about this morning's session we're hosting, session 11, how the Australian regulatory environment is evolving and the implications for patients and the industry. My name's Nathan Davis. I'm from MedReleaf Australia, Chief Operating Officer. It's in two parts today that we're discussing this. In the first part, pleased to present, and I'll introduce our speakers in a moment, from the TGA and the Office of Drug Control, Professor John Skerritt, and he is first up this morning. Professor Skerritt is head of the Products and Regulation Group, which works to safeguard and enhance the health of all Australians through effective, timely and risk-proportionate regulation of therapeutic goods, the control of drug import, export and production. He was formerly Deputy Secretary in the Victorian Government and has extensive experience in the medical and agricultural environment on policy, regulation, research management, technology application and commercialisation. John was previously Deputy Chief Executive to a Commonwealth Statutory Authority, a ministerial appointee on the Gene Technology and Technical Advisory Committee, Chair of the Board of a major international technical organisation as well. During the 90s, he held a senior management position in the Commonwealth Scientific Industry Research Organisation and Cooperative Research Centres. He has significant experience on boards of international and national organisations and more than 25 years' experience in negotiating and leading international, technical and commercial collaborations. He is currently Vice Chair of the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities and is Chair of the Scientific Advisory Council of the Centre of Innovation in Regulatory Science. And it's extensive, and not many people know, and I always am proud to present this, that John's also done some studies into cannabinoid research himself in the 80s. For everyone, there is a Q&A. Please put some question and answers in there. We will try and get to them, but I'm trying to get to John Skerritt to get his presentation. Over to you, John.
Thanks for the introduction, Nathan, and good morning, everyone. And yes, back in the 1980s when there was still a lot of interest, and then unfortunately for a decade or two, things went quiet in cannabis research. Some of the early lab work I did was indicative of a role, and I still remember reading a sentence from my thesis that says, it is possible that cannabidiol could have potential for treatment of epilepsy. And those words were written, and this is where it gets embarrassing, 42 years ago. So it's nice to see that I wrote my thesis when I was 2 years old, I should add. It's nice to see, not really, it's nice to see that, that has actually come to fruition. And just last Friday, the Ministerial Advisory Council for Medicinal Use of Cannabis met, and it has two of Australia's top epilepsy doctors, both of whom are very significant prescribers of medicinal cannabis products, the ARTG ones for pediatric cannabis and also pediatric epilepsy, and also some adults with epilepsy. So it's kind of nice sometimes that what may have appeared like speculation decades ago has actually come to pass. It shows sometimes that things do take a long time to actually go from A to B. Next slide. I'm just going to go to the next slide. Oh, there we are. It's very slow to change. So just to recap, and I show this slide every year, the intent of the medicinal cannabis regulatory scheme, both from the ODC side and from TGA side, is really to provide patient access, particularly to Australian grown and manufactured cannabis. That figure of 40% may be out of date. And of course, it's been changed a little bit with COVID and shipping and so forth. But we are starting to see one thing that's been, again, after maybe a bit of a slow start, but the industry was starting from scratch. We are starting to see a significant proportion of Australian grown and manufactured medicinal cannabis now entering into the market. And I think the people taking part in this conference will have a better sense than I will as to what the percentage is. It's sometimes hard to get figures like that. Clearly, the government is keen on quality medicine coming through doctors' prescriptions. Clinical trials for future medicines registration, that's been slow, but there's a lot of interest, particularly with clinical trials for Schedule 3 over-counter medicinal cannabis. And of course, as people are aware, there's two arms of the cannabis oversight, the Office of Drug Control and the TGA. States and territories still have roles for controlled substances, but another thing that's been reassuring in the last year or two in particular has been that areas of double regulation, you could argue, have been eased. So while for the Schedule 8s for drugs that are controlled drugs, such as those products containing THC, there are state and territory responsibilities that are there for all controlled drugs, especially for the Schedule 4 of the prescription medicines that contain cannabidiol as the main ingredient. A lot of those requirements for state and territory approvals have all gone by the board now, and I think that's great. So next slide. I'm going to talk mainly about TGA type issues, the implementation of Senate inquiry recommendations, how the scheme's going, reforms to the SAS and authorised prescriber scheme, although I think my colleague Petra will talk a little bit more about that. Compounding changes, Delta-8 THC, which is a substance of particular concern. A little bit about OTC cannabidiol, clinical evidence, supply and wholesaling, quality reforms and compliance. And Danielle Chifley is going to talk about the Office of Drug Control issues. So next slide, please. So the Senate inquiry on patient access, like a lot of things, seems to have faded into that world, but we've all forgotten about pre-COVID. Next slide. However, it's reassuring to see that many of the recommendations have been implemented in part or full, whether it's on education, reforms to SAS, scheduling, simplified prescribing through the SAS of cannabis products, changes to the authorised prescriber scheme, and alignment of state and territory legislation, as I mentioned, the removal of duplication. The government did not accept all the changes to be recommended by the inquiry, such as establishment of a new regulator or specific Medicare items, and there are a number of ones that were really focused on the states and territories. Now, just to remind people, there are really a couple of pathways for access to prescription medicinal cannabis pathways. They are largely still unapproved pathways because very few have been through the TGA or international regulatory processes for medicines, and these are prescription medicines, and so they haven't been fully assessed for safety, quality, and efficacy. And what the SAS and authorised prescriber does is to see that the patient indications are well defined, and especially for children, that the doses are appropriate and that products of appropriate quality are used. And we have other checks through our quality standard that we'll talk about later. Next slide, please. Now, we're getting very close to 250,000 prescriptions. There's been over 210,000 special access B prescriptions. The numbers have been at 11,500. Now, those monthly averages will drop off. And I think it will be really important for those of you who commentate on this industry, but that doesn't show a decrease in interest in patient access to medicinal cannabis. But what it means is, at long last, there's been a significant upkick in the number of authorised prescribers, and that's an even simpler system for patient access, whereby one doctor can prescribe for a given set of indications and a given class of product, any number of patients, and basically every 6 months just tell us how many patients they're prescribed for. It lowers the burden on prescribers and it lowers the burden on us. So we're expecting the SAS numbers to drop down a bit, but the actual total number of prescriptions we think will continue to increase. On top of the special access and authorised prescriber scheme, there's also the prescriptions of the TGA approved products, Sativex and Epidiolex. There's also compounding and special access scheme A notifications. The online schemes out there, I've mentioned already, there's a significant increase in authorised prescribers. We've got 716 who are active. Wide range of indications, although they are considered on a case-by-case basis. And we are publishing, in fact, we'll even publish more information soon, but we're already publishing more information on what sort of indications are approved on our website. And there's also a range of product types. Next slide, please. Now, this next slide is rather busy, but I just wanted to highlight the material highlighted in yellow. And if you add it up, it basically tells us that 80 to 85% of SASB prescriptions are for various forms of pain. Anxiety, insomnia, and sleep issues come in after that, but it's overwhelmingly pain. And I'll return to that issue later in my presentation, but just keep that back of your mind that 80 to 85% of the SAS applications are for pain. Now, my next one, Petra will talk to this, I assume, in more detail. But last November, we introduced a more streamlined approach for SAS and authorised prescriber. And it means that, could I have the next slide, please? It means that the submissions are made by active ingredient under various categories, and they're based on a cannabinoid content. And what that means is that it makes it easier for patients and prescribers that if suddenly a particular product is not available, they can go to another option within the same CBD to THC composition range. And they can also explore lower cost options. And that's the same for prescribing more generally. The lower risk ones, the ones that are higher in CBD, are also included in the authorised prescriber established history of use pathway. And that means the authorised prescribers don't have to go through an ethics committee or a specialist college endorsement. And so prescribers can write the generic name for a category like this, or if they wish, they can still do what they can for any medicine and write do not substitute, and here's a particular trade name. The decision is with the prescriber. And we have information on available products and sponsor details under each category on our website. And already, next slide please, this has driven quite significant prescribing behaviour changes. It's almost doubled the number of authorised prescribers of medicinal cannabis just since November, and a lot of them are using this established history of use pathway. And as I said before, that's led to a bit of a drop from, well, we actually had 13,000, I think, in September, down to 8,000 in January. I don't have the February figures, but perhaps my colleagues do. Now I want to go to some changes to the regulatory scheme as it affects patient access. So next slide. So after public consultation, government has endorsed that there will be changes to how medicinal cannabis products are compounded. And there were concerns about the lack of oversight or visibility on compounded cannabis products. There wasn't any documentation on the number of scripts, what they were used for, the quality of those products, including to children. And there was also a difference in how imported medicinal cannabis products and domestic products were handled, domestically manufactured products. And that reflects the fact we didn't have a level playing field. So now they're going to be treated similarly. And the bottom line is that to supply a compounded product, the same as any other source, you'll require authorised prescriber or SASB approvals. We've communicated this quite extensively, but I encourage people in this group to also communicate extensively to their networks. And as you know, the SASB turns around in 48 hours or less, and it's a fairly well-established system used now by well over 200,000 people. So it basically just brings compounded product into line. It means that for a small number of prescriptions that are highly inappropriate, such as very high THC or a poor quality product for a child, but at least the question can be asked, well, why are you compounding this product? Because remember, the other rules with compounding is that a compounded product is only to be used when a commercially available product is not available or suitable for that patient. Next slide, please. Now, Delta-8 THC, it's funny, when you talk to people, some people have never even heard of this. Other people seem to be full bottle on it. And like so many things, it's really taken off in the US. Why is it of concern? Well, Delta-8 THC is like Delta-9, except one of the carbon-carbon double bonds in the molecule is in a different position. And it's become popular because it can be chemically made. It's only found in trace amounts, 0.1%, maybe 0.5 in some strains, but generally very, very low amounts, not commercially feasible to extract from raw cannabis. So it's generally converted by cooking up cannabidiol with acids and solvents and heat, of course. I've used the word cooking. And you can get these products that are 30, 40, 50% Delta-8, has similar effects to Delta-9, but also with a lot of other unknowns in that mix. So you produce a product that's got a high amount of a psychoactive agent. Very little is known about the safety or activity of Delta-8, and also very little is known about the other things that may appear. And a lot of these products from American analytical studies seem to have bits of solvent and other chemicals still in them, never mind a whole lot of molecules that they don't know what they are. And so both the US Food and Drug Administration and the Center for Disease Control has warned against adverse events. So lethargy, slurred speech, breathing problems, coma even. They've had people in emergency departments with Delta-8. And the other challenge is that you get very high levels of psychoactive product. If you're making 30 to 40% of something that's 2/3 as psychoactive as THC. It is not legal in Australia, despite questions about it, because it's chemically manufactured. And the Therapeutic Goods Order 93 has been clarified. It already, by a reading of it, was not legal because it was a chemically manufactured product, but we're making it quite explicit. It also would not be a Schedule 4 or Schedule 8 substance, again, for a number of reasons, including the fact that it would be seen as a synthetic cannabinoid. We do need to reform the naming for prescribing to make it quite clear that Delta-8 is not able to be prescribed, and it is clearly not Schedule 8. And so there's a little bit of work to be done. But if I could go to the next slide. For those of you who are old enough to remember Captain Good Vibes, I just have a take-home message with Delta-8 THC. It just ain't legal. And I should also add that our laboratories has been asked by the Ministerial Advisory Council. As you're aware, we do market-based scans of products for compliance with TGA 93. And in that market-based scan, we've been asked to check Australian products for Delta-8. I'm not accusing any companies in Australia of deliberately doing the wrong thing, but I am worried that some of the companies may actually not know that some of the material they might be getting, especially from North American sources, but we don't know how big the problem is, has Delta-8 in it. And while we sometimes say, gee, THC hasn't been as thoroughly studied as we'd like, there's almost nothing known about the safety of Delta-8. And there'd be no other prescription medicine that you'd allow out there with absolutely nothing known about it. There's about 2 studies published 30 years ago with a handful of people. Now on to something more positive. Next slide. The safety review of low-dose cannabidiol, going back a little bit in history. Essentially, it showed that low doses had a safety profile like an over-the-counter medicine. Side effects of tiredness, diarrhea, appetite loss, a few temporary liver issues. And the main issue that people still don't really know a lot about is whether at low doses drug-drug interactions are significant. But as people are aware, and I go on to the next slide, low-dose cannabidiol was made Schedule 3, but with certain constraints. It's not available under the Special Access Scheme or authorised prescriber because the Advisory Committee for Medicine Scheduling was really keen that it be linked to particular indications, and therefore it needed to be through a TGA registered pathway. And that requires evidence of efficacy, safety. It requires a product to be manufactured in a GMP facility and so forth. It's for doses under 150 milligrams of cannabidiol, but scheduling limits can be changed if evidence of safety emerges. And so in discussions with a number of companies on this, we've said, look, feel free to run a clinical trial once, assuming you get the relevant approvals, for a higher dose as well. So a company might do a trial at 150 and they might do a trial at 300 for an indication like sleep or mild pain or something or other. And it may be, if the higher dose proves to be efficacious and you want to go forward with that, you then have the options either of a prescription medicine or you have the option of applying for rescheduling to over-counter for the higher dose if it's backed up with solid safety data. So there's a range of controls around this. No products on the market yet, but I do know a number of companies at various stages of clinical trials, and we've been having commercial and confidence discussions with a number. So that's quite encouraging. Next slide, please. Now, really, it's up to the companies and their trials to determine what the indications are. And there's really 2 sides to the indications. They need to be suitable for a consultation with a pharmacist. So remember, Schedule 3 means it's the actual pharmacist who the patient talks to and getting the prescription filled rather than picking it up off the shelf at the front of a chemist. And what I mean by suitable for a pharmacist is things like serious depression or epilepsy, for example, really need medical and generally specialist medical intervention. It wouldn't be suitable for a pharmacist to manage epilepsy, for example. So some of the things that are mentioned in the scientific literature are things like mild anxiety, assisting with sleep. You've got other over-counter treatments like melatonin, for example. Maybe manifestations of PTSD, but again, that will require close consultation about whether it's really getting into the grounds of psychiatry versus something that is suitable for a pharmacy to assist with. Pain, and again, the severity of the pain, the nature of pain. And there may be other indications. It's really up to the companies, but what we encourage any company to do, and they have been doing it, is if you're interested in an over-counter Schedule 3 product, come and have a meeting with us. It's free, come and have a chat. And, you know, if a company comes and says, look, we want to develop this and people can treat their own epilepsy, we'd say, look, really, that's not a Schedule 3 indication. Or we're not here to do a consultancy service on trial design, but we're happy to have those discussions. Now, one of my final muses, and remember I said I was to remember that figure on pain, next slide please, is remember that 85% of the prescriptions, between 80 and 85, but when you aggregate all the pain-related conditions, I reckon it's close to 85 for SASB, were for pain. Now, back in 2017, which seems like a long time ago, and with some updates in 2020, we published guidance documents just synthesizing the evidence for use of cannabis products in chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, epilepsy, MS, chronic non-cancer pain, palliative care. And there have been some more trials since then, but I guess I'll be frank, I'm a little bit disappointed in what's come out. There's been a few with fairly equivocal or negative results. There's only been a limited number with strongly positive results. And especially pain, even though 80 or 85% of SASB scripts are for pain, the evidence from, at least from clinical trials, is not all that convincing. It's stronger for neuropathic pain than it is for other forms of pain. And indeed, we have the international clinical groups on pain actually speaking out against it. So the Australian group, Faculty of Pain Medicine, the clinicians have said do not prescribe unless in a registered clinical trial. The International Association of Study of Pain, which is again clinicians, said insufficient evidence. So we're on the horns of a dilemma here. And so really, I think that we are stuck if we're not able to advance the development of clinical evidence. And one of the real dilemmas has been it's not possible for a number of reasons for the TGA to collect clinical outcomes information on SAS. We don't have the legal powers. I mean, if you think about it, if we've given approval to over 200,000 scripts, wouldn't have been a wonderful database had we had the legal powers to do it. But we didn't have those legal powers, and we don't have those legal powers. Doesn't mean that other groups can't assemble it for at least their own product with the consent of a doctor and a patient, but we don't have those legal powers. Now, just to wrap up, I'm going to talk about quality. So next slide. So there's been an update to our guidance about the legal pathways for supply and distribution. And it just clarifies the relationship between the sponsor and the wholesaler. Now, these slides and these guidances are available, so I'm not going to go through this one in incredible detail, but essentially sponsors can enter a distribution arrangement to third parties, but they still have to have direct control of the product. It doesn't mean the product has to be at their physical facility, but it means they have to have legal oversight and the product has to remain their legal property. So in other words, traditional wholesaling models for an unapproved medicine are actually not legal in Australia. And it's important to clarify that to make sure your supply chain is legal. I'll go on and talk about GMP and quality, and then I'll basically just finish with a little bit of information on compliance. So currently, if I go to the next slide, currently, as the domestic industry is aware, there's not a level playing field again when it comes to GMP. So currently only domestically manufactured cannabis products, APIs and products are subject to GMP. Again, government has approved now a level playing field for domestic and imported products that both have to comply with TGO 93. Now, TGO 93 actually can set minimum quality standards. And while TGO 93 is declaration and compliance based rather than application based, I want to assure you we do have a compliance program, testing samples, and as some companies know, we have gone back to them when the samples are out of spec, and indeed we have taken action. So we do have all the regulatory actions that we have in any form, but it's based on a compliance and monitoring approach rather than a pre-approvals approach. Now, next slide. After significant public consultation, government made a decision late last year for imported cannabis products to require GMP in the same way as domestic cannabis products. And this will be tied up with the TGO 93 standards, and it will require pharmaceutical GMP to a similar standard for domestic products. It's not a formal GMP clearance in the same sense as for prescription medicines, because we know that some medicines regulators don't inspect medicinal cannabis manufacturers. So we're very soon putting out detailed information on all this. It will require a declaration of compliance, which again, we can monitor and take legal action if the declaration is incorrect. So there's a lot of things within this framework where the sponsors make a declaration and we check up on a targeted or random way. And yes, we will check up on that. And we have the legal power to take action against the sponsor if they're not doing the right thing. Now, what does this manufacturing mean? If I go to the next slide, essentially products manufactured outside Australia must be in accord with one or more of the following guidances or regulations. And again, in some countries, they sit in regulation of manufacturing quality requirements for pharmaceuticals. In others, they sit in guidance. And there's a long list here that covers regulators all over the world. I won't go through that list, but it talks about what's required for the manufacturing steps and for the sites at which the product. And again, we'll be spelling this out very soon in guidance that we're going to put out. And that's based on the feedback from a number of public consultations that completed earlier. If I could go to the next slide, there were other aspects of quality changes that have come through following a public consultation. The first was about labelling requirements, and indeed these will come in soon with a suitable transition period. And also requiring reminding people that only plant-based cannabinoids and not things that are cooked up from plant-based or synthetic cannabinoids are legal. And child-resistant enclosures will be required. So if I go to the next slide, with a transition period enabling commencement in July 2023, changes to the quality standard, and again, it will only require the products supplied in Australia. So if you have an export-only listing, it is excluded. There's some streamlining. Again, the sponsors won't have to submit declarations of compliance. We'll instead conduct random and targeted monitoring. They will continue to be legally responsible. So even if you're not submitting a declaration of compliance, you have to do all that. And you have to submit 6-month reports on usage. Now, to cut to the chase, some of the changes are better identification of active ingredients, information on plant-derived materials, bit clearer on quantities and strength, child-resistant closures, and clarity about the requirements for microbial testing. So I'm just going to finish on some compliance points. So if I go to the next slide, on advertising of products, these are prescription medicines, and so advertising directly to consumers is illegal of products. You can, if you keep within certain bounds, indicate that you have a practice that, say, manages pain and that you look at a range of therapies, but specific medicinal cannabis products directly to the consumers remains illegal. We do have a number of approaches monitoring the activity of both illegal operators, those who might advertise cannabis on the web, and these are products that have not, for example, come in through the Office of Drug Control processes, or also clinics and pharmacies that are pushing the boundaries as far as promoting products and services. And here are just some stats. And again, this is a month ago, so the numbers will be higher now. We've looked at over 620 reports. We've already issued 17 fines. And there's a couple of cases going to court, 2 to civil and 1 for criminal cases. Now, sometimes we get quite angry things from the Australian industry saying, look, we hear this company on the web is advertising this. No, why aren't you doing something? Do something, do something. But we only have limited powers if, say, it's a US-based website advertising and accessible from Australia. And sometimes it's quite deceptive because you can actually have an Australian phone number and have no physical presence in Australia at all. So they are a bit beyond reach. If it's more about the nature of the activity of the clinic, we will refer it more to either APRA, or in some cases we have referred things to ACCC. Next slide. The other broad area of compliance relates to importation and supply of medicinal cannabis products. And again, we've had almost 100 investigations on importation and supply that may not have been appropriate. Again, we require testing of products in some cases, and we are taking action as required. And so our strong advice is make sure you're aware on all these things. And companies getting in this area, this is a commercial business dealing with a prescription medicine. So it's important to have assistance from a regulatory affairs consultant. And if need be, contact us and ask whether something's okay. Better that than to get a fine and infringement notice from us. So just to wrap up what's been a fairly wide-ranging tour of a table of matters medicinal cannabis and TGA. Next slide. So just to summarise, many but not all the recommendations of the inquiry, the Senate inquiry on patient access, were agreed by government and have been implemented. The ones that have not been implemented were generally those that were not agreed to by government. Rescheduling of low-dose cannabidiol is completed, but we don't have any products in market yet. But we had a number of discussions with companies, and we're very happy to talk to other groups. Prescription numbers are growing quickly, but the clinical evidence base, and I know this is a bit of a fraught discussion, saying, well, at the end of the day, what level of clinical evidence is required? Well, we take the view that this is a prescription medicine, but it's not so much it's more the prescriber and clinical base. As I said, the advisory council last Friday that met talked a lot about the fact that while there's a certain level of prescriber confidence in Australia, increasing prescriber confidence will be dependent on there being studies published to give people confidence, that there's efficacy and safety against a particular indication or a particular condition, to use the less technical word. Cost issues maintained. I'm sure that's been a theme in other presentations, but of course the law requires that for a drug to be pharmaceutical benefits scheme subsidised, the product has to be TGA registered. So that's an incentive. And again, that's something why we're really keen for there to be more TGA registered products. I've talked about the new manufacturing GMP and quality standards. We are still policing advertising of medicinal cannabis products, and please do report. We do want a level playing field, although I have mentioned that sometimes overseas websites are out of our reach. But as I said, we still have very few cannabis products in the ARTG. And so the things I worry about is why we haven't had more positive clinical trials. And indeed, we could have created a rod for our own back even here in Australia, but the ease of access through a special access scheme and authorised prescriber could create a disincentive to companies actually seeking TGA registration. And that's quite a significant policy dilemma, because unapproved medicines are just that. They're not approved, and they don't have the same confidence for many prescribers as medicines that have been through a regulatory process. And so I still very much hope that we will move towards more products on the register. Perhaps as we get some OTC cannabidiol products, it might drag other medicinal cannabis products to seek registration after that. Thanks for your attention, and if time permits, I'm very happy to take a few questions.
Oh, thank you, John. I was taking notes feverishly, being involved in the industry, as you know, from the early days. There are a couple of questions, and you did touch on some that were really important around our industry being a level playing field, and the compounding and GMP is a big thing around getting that level playing field. In relation to that, the timing. That's usually a process of a change. We did see in November a significant change, and I'm kind of segueing to, we've simplified a system, but have we confused it by adding 1 to 5 categories and an established history of use pathway for only some products? So question being directly around that, have we actually created more complexity than simplification?
Well, the 5 categories actually fit all the medicinal cannabis products. I'm not sure what you mean by only some products, that the products would fit into those 5 categories. And of course, if people don't like those 5 categories, they can pretend it doesn't exist and continue to write a particular brand name. So we're basically giving choice. What we are seeing, however, is a significant number of prescriptions in those 5 categories. So people are voting with their pens and prescription pads. So, but we're not forcing anyone to prescribe in those 5 categories. Prescribers can still prescribe by name. Similarly, with the authorised prescriber, we've seen more than a doubling in the number of authorised prescribers because of the established history of use. Again, we're not forcing any doctor to go down that pathway. They can go down the traditional authorised prescriber model using an ethics committee. So what those changes in November did was just give both prescribers, patients, pharmacists better options. And what we're hearing is that a number of patients are getting lower cost products, and more, just as importantly, they're not going through the frustrating cycle of having a script written for a particular named product. Then they get told it's a month until it can come into Australia, especially with COVID and supply chain disruptions. And then the whole cycle has to go back. The doctor has to write a script for something else. So people are voting with their feet and they're supporting these changes, but none of them are mandatory, and that a prescriber can still write a script for a particular brand.
No, that's understood. Question: would the TGA have considered moving to a Category C notification pathway for all cannabis and authorised prescribing for all doctors regardless of the established history of use? Because currently, right now, only oral forms are available through those pathways.
Oral forms, and also in the established history of use, it's a lower cannabidiol. No, it comes back to the fact that in this Category C, they are all medicines that have been either on our ARTG or on the German, American, British, Canadian, Japanese equivalent. In other words, the products that are Category C have all been thoroughly assessed by regulators for safety, quality, and efficacy as prescription medicines. Medicinal cannabis products are not. They do not have that history of having been through a medicines regulatory approvals process. And for that reason, a automatic approval, which is essentially what a Category C is, was not felt appropriate for safety and quality reasons.
Understood. One last probably question in relation to, and you did talk around clinical trial and pain, and we understood that. Do you believe that we've got a system where we're not understanding that cannabis is a generic drug? And I'm speaking from our point of view, and others that are in the manufacturing of products, and doctors that are out there are prescribing whole plant, full spectrum cannabis medicines. It's a challenge to go through a pathway when you've got double-blind placebo and the likes, for instance, when you've got taste. So if we were to do a trial on an oil, someone's having a placebo, that oil and the terpene, flavonoids, because it's full spectrum. So the reluctance around bringing a full spectrum into trial. So the question I've got is, you mentioned the SASB data. Would the TGA take aggregated SASB data on a full spectrum plant product through the ARTG process?
Possibly. It'd depend on the quality of follow-up. You are right that some, and you're not alone with cannabis, some drugs do provide bigger challenges in what we call blinding. There are still ways where, for example, if you were looking at an impact of THC on something, you could take a whole spectrum extract of a plant that's fairly low in cannabinoids. And you can also make placebos that have had particular substances removed. So it is more complicated, but it's not impossible to have a placebo that would still have the terpenoids, still have the same oily constitution, but say not have the THC in it, or maybe not have the high level of CBD in it. As we all know, there's very significant differences in levels of THC and CBD. And one of the solutions often is to use rather than a total placebo, you have 3 arms of a trial. You have a placebo arm that might be hard to blind. You have a very low THC or very low CBD full extract, which is a de facto placebo, and then you have one with a much higher and active level of drug in it, and that's for comparison that you use. So it makes it harder, but I don't think it makes it impossible by any means to conduct a trial.
I appreciate that. Well, we might save some of the questions if you are able to stay around. There is one more that I might pose, but it is for Petra, and it is probably in relation to what you mentioned about category 4 and 5. So if a doctor was to write a category 5 prescription right now, and it was presented to a pharmacy as a category 5, the patient could choose between a dried flower of, say, 16% to 30%. Was the
no? I'll cover that. I'll cover this in some more detail in my presentation. But the doctor is expected to include on the script enough detail that a pharmacist can identify a product. So this is no different from any normal practice. Doctor doesn't have to go back to the TGA every time for a new approval. If a new script is required to be issued, that's a much simpler process, as John outlined, than it is to go through the rigmarole of applying for a SASB application.
Yeah,
but
so
the doctor
private prescription should have the right amount of information, and so the pharmacist can identify that particular product specifically.
A product, that's right. And they may wish to include a brand name. They may not. For generic substitution, that's pharmacist's discretion. But there should certainly be enough information on dosage form, and strength and dose that a pharmacist can adequately identify a product. And if not, then a pharmacist would, as usual, call the doctor and make that clarification.
Yeah, that's understood. I appreciate that, Petra. Thank you. Well, we might move, conscious of time and everyone's presentations, and we want to get that panel session underway in the second half. I'm pleased to now present or introduce to you, Danielle Chifley. And so Danielle is the Director of the Medicinal Cannabis section in the Australian Government Department of Health Office of Drug Control. Danielle has a broad experience in public administration, law, regulation, policy, and legislative reform. Danielle has also got an exceptional track record in developing and implementing major government reforms across a broad range of program areas. And this includes medical cannabis and the therapeutic goods regulation, complex national energy cooperative schemes. So Danielle has over 15 years experience as a government lawyer in a wide range of advising, litigation and legislative development contexts, with particular expertise in administrative law and practice. Thank you for joining us today, Danielle. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. If perhaps we could move to the first slide, please. Today, I'm just going to provide a very brief introduction to the Office of Drug Control for anyone attending today who's not familiar with our role. I will briefly highlight some of our recent reforms in relation to medicinal cannabis, and I'd like to provide an overview of some of our future priorities. Next slide, please. If you're not familiar with us, the Office of Drug Control exercises powers conferred through domestic legislation and regulations, which give effect to several international treaties relating to narcotic drugs. Our key areas of responsibility are set out there on the slide. Our functions in relation to the regulation of medicinal cannabis cultivation, production and manufacture are provided in the Narcotic Drugs Act. We do have a range of other functions relating to internationally controlled drugs, as indicated there on the slide. For example, recently we've have a new role in relation to issuing permits for the commercial importation of kava. Next slide, please. We are focused on medicinal cannabis regulation though, and the scheme for medicinal cannabis was established under the Narcotic Drugs Act in late 2016. In 2019, Professor John McMillan undertook a review of the medicinal cannabis scheme to see how it was going at that point a few years in. As many of you know, the Macmillan Review made 26 recommendations in relation to the regulatory framework to improve its operation for medicinal cannabis regulation, reduce the regulatory burden on the industry, and allow greater flexibility in relation to the administration of the scheme. The Office of Drug Control has been progressively implementing those recommendations since the Macmillan Review, and they have culminated most recently on the commencement of reforms to the Narcotic Drugs Act on the 24th of December last year. And the key reform in that context was introducing a single licence framework for medicinal cannabis regulation under the Narcotic Drugs Act, replacing the previous 3 licence structure. Permits are continued to be used to manage the risk at an operational level, and we have concurrently reformed our permits framework, commencing at the same time. The objective there was to simplify the content, application process, and regulatory framework for permits, and we are currently in the process of transitioning our existing licence and permit holders to the new regulatory framework. Next slide, please. So in terms of medicinal cannabis regulation, our key focus moving forward, I will expand in more detail on this later in the presentation, is really to embed the medicinal cannabis reforms that we have been focused on over the last couple of years. That will include continuing to progress with further information and guidance and reviewing our website content in relation to the new reforms. Our key objective more broadly is to focus on increased transparency in relation to our regulatory framework. And as I said, we'll be providing some more detail on that in a moment. Next slide, please. Just completing though an overview of our functions, a core part of our regulatory functions and powers relate to monitoring and compliance activities. The Office of Drug Control takes a risk-based approach to compliance and monitoring, and that includes undertaking education and working closely with our regulated community. Our education campaigns will be focused on industry trends in relation to particular issues of concern that have been identified, and we will continue to make sure that we are undertaking an inspection regime on a risk-based approach. Next slide, please. Our licence and permit holders will be supported in understanding their regulatory obligations through a new reporting framework. The reporting will assist with compliance of licence holders in relation to the conduct of activities under their licence and permits. The reporting framework is part of our recent reforms and complements the changes to our licence and permit regimes. And importantly, the new reporting requirements will assist Australia to meet its international reporting obligations to the International Narcotic Drug Control Board, the INCB, which, as you saw from the earlier slide, is part of the ODC's regulatory functions under the International Drug Conventions. The new reporting requirements will be required for the quarter from April to June, with the first reports being due in mid-July. Before then, however, we're encouraging licence and permit holders to familiarise themselves with the new reporting requirements, templates and guidance that are available on our website, and encouraging them to take the opportunity to practice reporting on that template for the January to March period to assist in a smooth transition to the new reporting framework. Further information about reporting is available on our website. Next slide, please. Moving forward, I just wanted to highlight some of the key upcoming objectives for the Office of Drug Control, and they relate to reviewing our fees and charges and cost recovery framework, further transparency about our compliance and enforcement objectives, and more transparency in terms of regulator performance reporting. Next slide, please. Now that we've made the significant reforms to our licence and permit framework I mentioned earlier, it's important for us to focus on our fees and charges and cost recovery framework to make sure they're closely aligned to the recent changes. So we are reviewing our cost recovery arrangements in accordance with the Australian Government charging framework, which takes an activities-based, activities-based costing principles applied through that framework. Any changes to our fees and charges will be require government approval. We will be consulting on those in due course, and any changes to our fees and charges would take effect in the next financial year. If you are interested in more information about our fees and charges framework, the Medicinal Cannabis Cost Recovery Implementation Statement, the CRIS, is available on the Office of Drug Control's website. That document is revised annually and is available there and will be consulted on in terms of changes through this reform process. Next slide, thank you. Another area of our recent focus relates to the Office of Drug Control's compliance and enforcement framework. Now, I was very hopeful in developing these slides that might be available today on our website, or at least available as we speak today on our website. And my understanding is it will be available very soon. That compliance and enforcement framework has had some consultation and input from industry, and thank you to those who contributed through that process. The framework will outline the compliance principles, activities and tools that the ODC uses to fulfil its regulatory obligations, and will illustrate how the compliance and enforcement options will be utilised through the Office of Drug Control on a risk-based approach. The framework is consistent with the ODC's publication towards the end of last year in October, available on our website, which is the Risk Management Approach to the Cultivation, Production and Manufacture of Medicinal Framework. The Compliance and Enforcement Framework just provides that next level of detail in terms of information and specificity. The compliance framework is intended to assist licence holders to understand their obligations and the tools that the ODC uses to manage risk. Next slide, please. The Australian Government has a whole of government framework for regulators, the Regulator Performance Framework, which measures the performance of regulators. It encourages regulators to undertake their functions with the minimum impact necessary to achieve our regulatory objectives and to effect positive, ongoing and lasting change. The Office of Drug Control currently doesn't report under the Regulator Performance Framework, but we are moving to do so from the next financial year, including reporting in accordance with the Regulator Performance Guide, which has been recently revised. On the slide there, you've got the 3 key principles set out in the Regulator Performance Guide that will inform the Office of Drug Control's focus in this regard. And a part of our process of moving to reporting in accordance with the regulator performance framework includes the Office of Drug Control last week publishing our first business plan, and that provides an overview of our key priorities from January to June, so for the remainder of this financial year, and it has been developed to reflect the principles in the Regulator Performance Guide. So I commend that to you. It is available now on the Office of Drug Control's website. And the next slides that I have just provides a brief summary of our key priorities. So our 5 key priorities in the Office of Drug Control's business plan focus on transparency, collaboration and engagement, meeting our international obligations and managing risk, and continuous improvement. Our focus on engagement and collaboration continues to build on the achievements that we've made in this area over recent time. We want to make sure that we are continuing to engage with our stakeholders, not only with industry, but with other Commonwealth, state and territory agencies. In terms of transparency, I've mentioned earlier that one of our focuses, particularly in relation to medicinal cannabis, is to embed our recent reforms, and that will include continuing to improve our guidance in relation to those changes for industry. A key part of that, and something that I think industry will be interested to hear, is that we'll be focusing on developing and publishing key performance indicators relating to our functions and activities. And part of this will include clear service level standards, for example, in relation to our assessment timeframes for licence and permit decisions. Part of our development of KPIs will mean that we will then report on our achievements against those annually through our activities under the Regulator Performance Reporting Framework. Next slide, please. Of course, the Office of Drug Control is focused under the business plan across this next period to continue meeting our international obligations and effectively and appropriately managing risk. Again, our focus is to continue with continuous improvement, to regularly review our procedures and processes and ensure that they remain relevant and identify opportunities for efficiency gains. A key focus in terms of continuous improvement will be to review the Office of Drug Control's website. There is a broader website redevelopment project across other parts of the department, and this will form part of that, but it will be timely and useful for our industry stakeholders in particular to have the opportunity of a revised website to more clearly align with our revised functions. Next slide, please. The next 2 slides that we've just got here to conclude the presentation today are available on our website. I'm not going to take you through the detail of these today. What we've done is to provide an overview of some of the changes to the regulatory framework for medicinal cannabis and the recent licence and permit reforms. So this slide provides an overview of what's changed and the key benefits, particularly to industry, for the medicinal cannabis licence changes. And the next slide similarly provides an overview of the changes that have been made through the recent permit reforms and highlighting the benefits again of those changes. I just refer you to those if you're particularly interested. And again, more information is available on our website, including those slides. So that really concludes, I suppose, the overview of my presentation today, really providing an update in terms of our regulatory reforms and some of the key objectives across the near future for the Office of Drug Control. If there are any questions, I'd be very happy to take some.
Thanks, Danielle. That was a great update, and well done with the change to the single license. It's a big move. Just a quick question, and I'm conscious of time. Will the ODC move towards digital copies of import-export permits, such as other jurisdictions do currently?
Look, that's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. You're correct that, as I understand it, we don't have a digital process. It is paper-based. If there are any particular inquiries about that, I'd encourage you to contact the Drug Control section. The email address for that is on our website. I'm sorry, I can't help you with that.
No, that's great. I'm sure just one that I had pre-prepared just in case. So that we didn't have any in the Q&A, but I appreciate your time today and look forward to seeing you.
No problems at all. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Next in our line of great panel and great speakers today is Petra Bismire. And Petra is Director of Experimental Products Section, the International Regulatory Branch of the Australian Government Department of Health. Petra has been a part of and administers the patient access pathways for therapeutic goods, including not included in the ARTG, and this means the Special Access Scheme, Authorised Prescriber Scheme. And Petra's regulatory experience also includes pre-market evaluation, pharmacovigilance, inspection, periodically safety update, report evaluation, and prior to her work as a regulatory scientist, Petra has worked as a pharmacist both in hospital and community settings in clinical roles. Thank you for joining us today, Petra. Over to you.
Thanks, Nathan, and thanks so much for having me along to talk about the recent reforms to cannabis. So I'll just be building a little bit on what John's already talked about, providing some more detail. So to the next slide, please. So late last year, the TGA made a number of major reforms to the medicinal cannabis access framework, as John outlined. And in order to reduce regulatory burden for sponsors, we removed the requirement for sponsors to submit a TGA 93 declaration form to the TGA application. And we also introduced a form to streamline the existing 6-monthly reporting obligations. In addition to streamlined processes for prescribers, we moved to applications by active ingredient, began publishing a list of medicinal cannabis products on the TGA website, and included medicinal cannabis categories and indications in the authorised prescriber established history of use. Next slide, please. So it's really important to remember that your responsibilities haven't changed. So whilst we have removed the requirement for sponsors to submit a declaration form of conformity with the Therapeutic Goods Order number 93, your responsibility to comply with the TGA 93 has not changed. So sponsors are legally responsible for ensuring that products comply with the TGA 93, as well as any other relevant orders. And this includes the TGA 100 or the microbiological standard for medicines. So I guess the TGA 93 declaration form was really introduced largely as an educational tool. And this was to allow sponsors to know that, to ensure that sponsors knew obligations as a sponsor. However, since the industry has matured significantly since 2016, 2017, when it was brought in, and knowledge of regulatory requirements is now expected, and the need for the form itself became an administrative burden to both industry and to us. However, it's important to know that these obligations to comply do stand. So it is an offence under the Therapeutic Goods Act to import, export or supply therapeutic goods that don't conform to an applicable standard, and failure to comply with the TGA 93 is subject to a range of regulatory compliance actions, including civil and criminal penalties. And there's further guidance on complying with TGO 93 and TGO 100, which is available on our website. Next slide, please. Thank you. So continuing our audit. So instead of collecting the TGO 93 forms, instead we're developing courses to expand our TGO 93 compliance programs. So we're continuing our program of targeted laboratory testing and other compliance assessment as part of our TGO 93. And laboratory tests include, but aren't limited to, consistency with claims of the stated content of and analysis of impurities. And you're reminded that your goods must comply with the advertising code as well. And that's because all material with information about the goods, which includes the label, must be truthful, balanced, and not misleading, and promote safe and proper use. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. Another step we've taken is to improve processes for sponsors by introducing an approved form for sponsors' 6-monthly reports. So this has been an existing legislative requirement since, I believe, 1992 or 1994. But the quality of the data that we were receiving was highly variable because there wasn't an approved form in place. An approved form that is intended to streamline processes for sponsors. So reporting periods are January till June and July to December, and the reports must be submitted within 1 month of the relevant reporting period closing. So on the next slide, I've included a shot of the a picture of the form itself. So it's important to note that reports must include the active ingredient and the trade name. Sponsors are required here to self-declare the category of active ingredient, so category 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, as well as the quantity supplied under each pathway. So only goods supplied during the reporting period should be included on the list. So don't include products which have previously been supplied, products which are available for supply, or products which might become available for supply. It's only products that were supplied during this 6-month period. We're drafting a guidance document at the moment to assist sponsors in the form, and we're hoping to publish that in the next month or so. So watch this space there. And it's really important that these reports are submitted in a timely manner. This data is actually used to publish the list of medicinal cannabis products by active ingredient category on our website that I'll talk about. But this data is used for that purpose. Importantly, reports must be submitted within 1 month of the reporting period closing. Reporting period closes in June, then the report must be submitted by 31 July. Okay. The TGA has also made some changes to prescribing process for health practitioners. So the SAS and authorised prescriber submissions for medicinal cannabis products can now be made by active ingredient rather than trade name. And John's touched on this already. But on the next slide here, I've got a graph showing the breakdown of the categories that we've chosen. So products are categorized by 5 broad categories of cannabinoid content. So, and it's interesting to note, we've priced these on the basis of the cannabidiol content. So that's important to know. Essentially, the categories are, for example, category 1 is 98% or more cannabidiol, with the remaining 2% being made up of other cannabinoids. And we've got our CBD dominant, which is 60 to 98% CBD. What we're calling balanced products, which are typically approximately 50-50. So we're saying in the description here that cannabidiol, with the remaining cannabinoids being made up of other cannabinoids other than cannabidiol. And we're recognising here that in the next 2 categories in particular, that the most common other cannabinoid is going to be THC. So we've named these THC dominant or THC medicinal cannabis products, but there is scope there for products which include other cannabinoids or are dominant in other cannabinoids there too. If we go to the next slide, in order to support professionals in prescribing and supplying medicinal cannabis products, we've also begun publishing a list of medicinal cannabis products by category. And this is not a means of promotion. This is intended to support healthcare practitioners in prescribing under these categories. It's a fairly new system, and we understand that it has some complexity. We felt that it was necessary to provide some extra support for healthcare professionals. So the initial list was compiled based on data that we collected from any sponsor submitted a TGA 93 declaration form. However, we'll update the list based on data collected from those 6 monthly reports. So essentially, this list will represent a snapshot of medicinal cannabis products that have been accessed via the SAS and authorised prescriber pathways in the preceding 6-month period. Every 6 months, we'll replace the old list with the new list of products which were supplied in Australia, these two pathways. And so as the reporting periods I mentioned close in January and July, it's anticipated that the list will be updated in February and August, but this February we've allowed a little more time. So we're expecting to update that list in the next couple of weeks before the end of March, hopefully. This is just to allow a longer lead time for reports. It is important to understand that it's up to a doctor's discretion to make a decision to prescribe an unapproved product, and that they need to have weighed up the risks associated with an unapproved good in their particular patient's circumstances. And it's also as to which unapproved product they intend to use. And prescription medicine names must adhere to the principles of the advertising code. So all claims, including the medicine name, must be truthful, balanced, not misleading, and not promote improper use. For example, prescription medicine names must not trivialise or encourage the use of these products. As we may need to redact product names where they've been considered not to comply with the principles of the advertising. We have published a guidance document for sponsors of medicinal cannabis products to assist you with adhering to the principles of the advertising code. On the next slide, I've just got a bit more of a description of the addition of the lower risk categories. So that's categories 1, 2, and 3 to the authorised prescriber established history of use pathway. And that's been made for specified dosage forms and indications, as we outlined earlier. So at the moment, it's included, categories 1 and 2 are included for oral liquid and oral capsules for chronic pain and for treatment of anxiety. In both those cases for refractory indications where the doctors have tried other treatments and failed. And category 3 has been included again for oral and for chronic pain. And essentially this means that doctors can apply to become authorised prescribers without the need for approval from a human research ethics committee. So prescribers will receive a TGA approval for a category and then issue prescriptions for any product within that category without the need to reapply to the TGA each time. And likewise, authorised prescribers must also report the number of patients that they treated every 6 months via a 6-monthly form, and they can do that online via the online portal. So we may review the established history of use list from time to time. There are other non-medicinal cannabis products included in the established history of use pathway, and this gets reviewed every 6 to 12 months for consideration as to whether more products may be considered to meet our definition of meeting the established history of use in terms of safety. So on the next slide, I've just got a bit of a description here, which we've discussed a little already, but essentially how will the current changes affect prescribing? So the move to issue TGA approvals by category of active ingredient is designed to reduce administrative burden for prescribers and for patients and provide more flexibility. And this is largely to account for what we were finding in the industry as frequent changes to product names, frequent shortages, particularly as John pointed out with the current COVID situation causing stock issues worldwide. And so this allows doctors to change between different brands or different products without needing a new SAS or authorised prescriber approval letter. So we've developed these five broad categories. However, as I mentioned earlier, it is expected that the prescriber includes enough detail in a prescription that a pharmacist can adequately identify a product to be selected. So generally, a prescription should include an active ingredient name, a strength, dosing information, and quantity. And as I mentioned earlier, a brand name may be included if the prescriber feels that it's clinically relevant, but that's and this is no different for any other prescription. So a decision to substitute between brands or whether a new prescription is required is a decision made by the pharmacist on a case-by-case basis. And as with any normal practice, this may include consultation with a patient prescriber. So essentially, will receive a TGA approval for a category of medicinal cannabis. It will then issue a prescription and provide enough detail that the pharmacist knows what they can dispense. If the product's not available, then the pharmacist can make a decision as to whether a new prescription is needed. The case, the doctor can issue a new prescription without the need to go back to the TGA for a new approval letter. And we've included some education on the TGA website and through our other educational platforms, but we've also engaged MPS Medicine-wise to educate pharmacists and doctors further on these new changes. And then just on these last slides, John's already outlined the general trends, but I thought I'd just show the graphs as well. Here you can see the huge uptake in authorised prescriber pathway. As of the end of last month, we've got 843 active authorised prescribers for medicinal cannabis, and since November, since the reforms were introduced, 90% of these authorised prescribers have made applications via the established history of use pathway. And on the last slide, you can see that we have seen a bit of a plateauing in SAS B numbers, as John outlined. So at our highest point, we had around 13,000 in September. January saw around 800.
And we do expect, as John outlined, to see that general trend continuing with the authorised prescriber route now being sort of the preferred pathway for many prescribers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Petra. Appreciate your time and that information. We are conscious of our second session, but there was one couple of questions that I might pick up. So, are you concerned about the inaccurate product information that appearing on the lists of products of active ingredients and about products being included in the wrong category? So is the TGA considering taking a more active role in verifying or checking that information from suppliers or sponsors, I should say?
Yeah, we will be conducting compliance activities. So the categories are self-reported, self-declared, and we'll be running targeted compliance activities to ensure that those, as
always, the responsibility lies with the sponsor
to ensure that they know what's in their product.
No worries. And you mentioned NPS Medicine-wise. Are they commencing the education on this new category-based medical prescription that you mentioned?
Yeah, that's right. So they'll be running some educational forums and other platforms to help educate GPs in particular on the authorised prescriber pathway and category-based approval system, and with pharmacists on how to dispense under these pathways.
Yeah, we had a couple of pharmacists yesterday that did comment on that it is complex when you've got presented with a large variety of products. They're all in various locations on how to order and how to get access. So there was a bit around that. I'm going to summarise. There's a constant theme in the Q&A, and it's directly related to, I think, in relation to a private prescription being written. You mentioned active ingredient. Now, under the TGA, when you do the approval, the active ingredient search for the doctor to do the approval starts with category. So if a prescription is written as category 5 prescription dried flower and was presented to a pharmacy, at that point, that says that it's obviously in that category. A patient's and a pharmacist is making a decision. I'm just worried that this is going on, and perhaps there might be some inappropriate prescriptions being written and dispensed if that's the case. Are you worried about that?
I mean, essentially, the TGA regulates products. We don't regulate prescriber practice. I trust in our doctors and pharmacists to do the right thing. We need to provide them with additional education, and we're doing that to support. So, as I mentioned, we've published the list of products by category in order to help provide assistance, and we've engaged MPS Medicine-wise, and we're providing more education ourselves as well. But essentially, the message is for any other prescription. So, as for any other prescription, a doctor would be expected to detail on a prescription that a pharmacist knows what they can dispense. And likewise, if a pharmacist has any confusion about what product they should be prescribing, then they can pick up the phone. As a pharmacist myself, we commonly have to pick up the phone, and I understand that the medicinal cannabis space is different. It has its own challenges and may take some getting used to. But I trust in our doctors and pharmacists to if they want to educate themselves. I trust in them to educate themselves if they are working with these products to ensure safety of our patients.
Totally agree there. Appreciate that. Well, we might appreciate your time today, and thank you and for making patient access available and continuing to do so in trying COVID times. So thank you, Petra. We do have second part. Thank you. We do have our second part of today's session, and it is a really a big one, but I won't go into the introductions. We have lost one of our presenters due to him having other appointments. He was Dr. Jamie Rickcord. You can read our bios of our presenters in our panel session now, but I'll introduce them very briefly. Elisabetta Faenza from LeafCan, and Clare Barker from Entoura, who are obviously very active in our industry here. So welcome to you both today. I'll make sure.
Thanks so much, Nathan.
Excellent. So, wow, a lot of information there to take on board. Where do we start? Takeouts, a couple of points from yourself, Clare. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, look, so I think firstly, it's really great that TGA do give the time, and obviously quite a lot of time this morning to discuss the things that are of interest to them today. For me, from John's presentation, I think how very clear he was on the Delta 8 THC was really great. So, and I think he put it quite nicely that that there may be people who are maybe sponsors who are unaware they've got illegal product in the country. And I think, Elisabetta, being in this industry, we know that there are Delta 8 products here in Australia at the moment. So I think today put a pretty clear line in the sand that sponsors need to take a close look at their products. And if there is Delta 8 THC products on the market, they need to be removed. So that was a really interesting thing. It was good to hear the discussion about the category-based approvals, and I am a big supporter of them in principle. I think there is a lot of issues still with the implementation. I won't go too much into that, but I think we can go through in our panel discussion on that. And not least of all, there is a great deal of confusion at the pharmacy level, and we know that because we talk to multiple pharmacists on a daily basis. Interestingly, there is a great article that was published yesterday by honlead.com.au that actually references New South Wales Health, Victorian Health Departments, more along not what the TGA's role in that is, but again, what the prescriber responsibility is. So, and I'm really looking forward to NPS medicine-wise education on that. The hard part is it was implemented in November. We're sitting in March and that education hasn't been delivered yet. So my only encouragement is great on TGA's behalf, but the implementation wasn't as smooth, and that is causing problems for doctors, patients and pharmacists.
Yeah, it is complex. Cannabis, we're complex and we don't need it any more complex, do we, Elisabetta? Your thoughts on some of the things that were said?
Look, exactly. I would wholeheartedly agree with Clare on the major points that she picked up from the presentation. And I think the surprise was that the categorisation system wasn't notified to people who, had products coming through the pipeline, either as sponsors or producers. And, indeed, we're actually getting those products through the TGA system for special access and authorised prescribers when it all changed. And so, some people were in the middle of getting new products onto the market and had this kerfuffle. And then really nobody knew, really how to take it or how doctors would then apply this new categorisation system. So I was really heartened to hear in multiple times with John and also with Petra talking about the fact that doctors can continue to prescribe in the way they always have. They now have a simplified program with the categorisation system so that the new system hasn't replaced the old, so doctors can continue to go through an authorised prescriber or special access scheme pathway as they have before. But for those who, especially for those category 1, 2 and 3 products, can switch over to authorised prescriber more easily without an ethics approval, and also that they can they can report in arrears rather than seek approval in advance. So I think those things definitely streamline the burden for doctors, because one of the biggest barriers to patient access is the burden on GPs, and GPs having a lot on their plate. We're asking them to do more and more all the time. And while what we're hearing is that it's life-changing for many patients to be switched on to medicinal cannabis where other therapies haven't worked, and doctors are finding a great deal of satisfaction from having these tools now available. What we always want to do is not make their life harder. We want, and I agree with Clare that the rollout of that program was not optimal. It's really clear that the intent of the TGA was a very honourable one, to make things more streamlined, to lessen the burden. But just the rollout, maybe education prior to making the changes live would have been better for all concerned.
I agree. Midstream changes, when there's little interaction or ability to counsel, consult, and you're in midstream, in like you said, it does make a challenge. The Delta 8, but one of the other things around levelling the playing field, I've got to say, is compounded products using this process. Like, if we want to be seen as an industry that is going to be a leadership in pharmaceutical cannabis, then ultimately finished products going through a registration of route, and John touched on that. The compounded piece is a big one. Cannabis isn't generic, and I think the TGA is now recognising that through that. So I look forward to, again, the bodies doing their job around assisting that. But your take on the compounding scenario?
Yeah, look, I think that everyone's relieved that there has been some moves on this, because while the vast majority of compounding pharmacists, abide by the law in both the letter and the intent, there are always some outliers who find loopholes and rort the system. And, both the industry and the TGA become aware of those kinds of rorts. Where, mass production of product was occurring under a so-called compounding license, and none of those products met a GMP standard, and they were produced before the prescription was received, which is not the intent of compounding. So I think we're all really happy that that loophole has been closed, because, again, with domestic producers of medicinal cannabis being required to comply with GMP guidelines and also TGO 93 and 100, when we're just closing the loophole for imported products, we don't want to encourage another loophole domestically in compounded products. So I think that's a relief to everyone.
No, I agree there. Just a quick, and just for everyone that's listening, we're going to run the session a bit over today. We're going to go into the morning tea just so we can have some more Q&A and a bit of chat going on. In relation to the clinical trial that John mentioned, he said pain's there. He mentioned something around, well, the SAS data's there, but in also in his presentation, the SAS data is actually reducing because there's increase in authorised prescribing. So the accessibility for companies and businesses associated with that, it's going to be a more of a challenge to actually prove that. If they've got a product that's available in prescribing in both areas, that could see a challenge. Do you see that being a challenge, Claire?
Yeah, look, clinical trials are a really difficult topic, and it's a very costly topic in an area where there is very little IP available. It is a product that has been, unless you're getting into very unique dosage forms, which have got really long runways of development and IP associated with them. And look, in Entoura, as a company, we did put one of our SA products into a 30-patient crossover RCT last year. We have done abstract results, and that was for sleep. So that was a balanced product. That was quite a costly exercise, but we do feel that there is a need to get that research available. It needs to be done. We need to be able to get our products registered on the ARTG. There is no question we need to do it. We have spent a lot of time working through our S3 clinical registration strategy, and that's not an easy pathway. As John mentioned, you've got, for what conditions you can put into an S3, things like sleep, there's already melatonin who's there, and what's the cost of a melatonin product versus what the cost of a medicinal cannabis product will be. So you have to look not only where you can get your evidence from an S3 pathway, but also what will the cost of the product be compared to the other S3 products into that in that situation. And you are really talking about self-limiting conditions mostly when you're talking about S3 pathway. So yes, we do need a clinical data, or I don't know very many companies who are not furiously working on a clinical pathway. The hard part is that there is also a lot of observational studies that have been done, some real world data, and I think that we need to be able to look at that when we are looking at TGA to be more open to that being used for some registration. So there's got to be able to do it. We have some really great pathways where we actually have our OST-LA for our complementary medicines, so where they are herbal products, where you are talking about a broad spectrum of the ingredients in there. TGA regulate them really well, and I think if we bridge the pathway between our prescription medications and our registered or our listed assessed complementary medicines, I think there would be really high quality, good products with good clinical data that could be put onto the market.
Yeah, I agree, Claire. I think that, especially for the broad spectrum products where we're looking at an entourage effect, which has been, discussed many times across many presentations over these 2 days, that they fit really well into that new category, rather than being forced down an RCT pathway where some of those, other entourage components, it's hard to pick out which is actually the active that's creating the effect. We're the same, Claire, in that we've got a commitment to a clinical trial as well at LeafCan with Adelaide University, looking at the treatment of chemotherapy-induced mucositis with phytocannabinoids. But again, there's a really long pathway, $1.5 million from the government to contribute to that, but obviously lots more money to be spent on it. And, a lot of time, more than a year in design and ethics approval before you even get anywhere near a patient, let alone the product design. So the real world data is also a hot topic. Many of you know that I'm currently based in the UK, and we're seeing here in the UK a real push for real world data to be accepted. What I would say is that data needs to be product specific. It needs to be really well designed capture of that data. It needs to obviously be ethically captured. But I think because there are large numbers in Australia of people using these products under special access and authorised prescriber, we've got a real opportunity here to capture that data where other countries do not. And so really working, I think, we should all take up the opportunity that was offered by John Skerritt today to go in and talk to the TGA around how we might design some real world data studies or capturing, post-market surveillance data through special access and authorised prescriber to beef up those folios when the dossiers are submitted for, the registration of a product. So I think these are exciting things, but there's a lot of work to do. But I have to say that being here in the UK, Australia is light years ahead of the UK in terms of both patient access and regulatory oversight, because in the UK, products are getting to patients with absolutely no GMP, no C of A's, no consumer medical information, no truth in labelling. So, Australia needs to pat itself on the back. It's a hard thing that we're doing. And yes, there's been some missteps, but we are light years ahead of other regulatory environments.
Yeah, I didn't get to ask John when he was talking about that in relation to how would he go about doing a product registration for a dried flower, because when we've got the increasing prescription of dried flower in the market happening over the last 12 months, doctors are finding where this sits as a breakthrough treatment, symptom relieving. But again, you've got the whole plant there, randomized controlled trial in a double-blind placebo. How do you recreate that plant and have a placebo plant? It's just not reality. And so we are square peg round hole. I've got a comment. We are trying on one area, but not understanding the complexity in another area. When we look at some of the, we're all talking about trials and the costly involvement of them. Observational trials are still costly to run. Getting the data, rounding that up. It's everyone is working towards that, but how do we actually help the TGA understand the plant further? That's probably
I think we also need to really get the investment community more aware, because in general, if a company has a commitment to research, investors run in the opposite direction because they may have had bad experiences with previous pharmaceutical product development companies. And so, but it's essential because I think there's this broad spectrum of products, some of which are really herbal products and fit into the OST-L type of category. And I think, really flower probably fits more comfortably there than it would fit into, a registered product. But there are some products that will be very specific condition outcomes, and they'll be very much about, more isolate products or a couple of active molecules combined rather than 130 active different types of molecules all entouraging together. And then there's products in the middle that may always stay in special access and authorised prescriber because they'll never be able to go down the the RCT registered product route. So I think we've got to kind of live with the fact that we can't make everything, as you say, fit into the same shape hole, because there's actually lots of different pegs, not one peg.
Yeah, that's right. I'll go to a quick question that has popped up. So could real-world patient data reporting outcomes as increasingly seen in future fund grant applications? I'm not sure if that's related to someone particularly going after research, but I guess gathering not only your own information, but other data that's samples around the world.
So I think where that's kind of coming from is that there's two components to patient access. One is actually the TGA registration. The other one is patient cost. And obviously for a lot of patients, they need to have the products on the PBS. One of the things that I think a lot of people, and traditionally pharmaceutical companies have done, is they've designed their clinical trial and then they've got their registration and then they went, I don't actually have the pharmacoeconomics data to actually submit my PBS application. So I think that's kind of saying is there an opportunity to actually start using that real world data to start generating some of that pharmacoeconomics data, which therefore will allow you to put your submission in for the PBS listing. So yes, there is an opportunity. Do I think that's necessarily been clearly thought through and designed in a lot of our collection of data in the real world? No, I don't believe it has. But I think that some of the things that as us as sponsors really do need to start thinking about is what medications were the patients on, what medications did they come off, what is the cost, etc. Because the more we can build that up, it's going to be great that we go, okay, fantastic, we've got our registration now, but we still may not have enough data to actually put that for that PBS approval to come through. So I think that's kind of where that's sitting.
Yep.
Yes, agree. Yeah, I do. I absolutely do think that's exactly where it's sitting. And this is some work that I'm looking at doing in Scotland with a couple of institutes and universities here. It's actually looking at the global political economy of medicinal cannabis and actually understanding the economic impacts across a whole range of sectors, but especially in health savings. And we talk a lot about that and there's sort of anecdotal evidence, but we need to actually really do on the academic side some really thorough research projects and publications around this, because for government to take it seriously and actually understand the health economic benefits that these products represent.
And that sums it up. It is us about collectively moving the cart forward, each peg at a time, each push of the cart. It is a patient-driven market, and it is an industry leadership market. I appreciate both Elisabetta, your time. I know it's early over there. Clare, your time today. Thank you. That concludes our overextended session. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have, and appreciate your time. Enjoy. Thank you.